just a reminder, our theme for today is biodiversity and God in all things. And Brother Mark Mackey is going to be presenting for us in just a few minutes. So we are so grateful that he is here with us. But to begin, like I said, we're going to start with an opening prayer. And since our theme is biodiversity, we're going to just do a brief litany for biodiversity. If you've watched the news lately, you've probably seen that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service declared 23 new species extinct in the month of September. And we know that about 1 million of the Earth's 8 million other plant and animal species are also threatened currently. And so, this is the fastest vanishing of species that we've experienced in 10 million years. And so with this reality, we're going to be invited to pray in lamentation for the loss of so many beloved creatures. So we'll begin in the name of the Creator and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And to begin, in Laudato Si, Pope Francis reminds us of the inherent dignity and worth of all plants and animals and ecosystems when he writes, "Each year sees the disappearance of thousands of plants and animal species, which we will never know, which our children will never see, because they have been lost forever. The great majority become extinct for reasons related to human activity. Because of us, thousands of species will no longer give glory to God by their very existence, nor convey their message to us. We have no such right." And so for this lamentation and honor and remembrance of some of the 23 species, we're going to watch and listen to the calls of two birds that have been declared extinct. The ivory-billed woodpecker was the largest woodpecker in the United States, and the Bachman's warbler was actually one of the smallest warblers, and it lived in the southeast part of the United States and migrated to Cuba. And I think for me, what has been impactful is reading about these species and reading about them in the past tense. So when you look them up now, it says, the ivory-billed woodpecker was. And so I'm just going to invite you to, there will be some images on the screen, or you can just listen to the calls of these birds. And so we lament the loss of these magnificent species, and we pray that the echoes of their calls move us to action to protect biodiversity and the many species of plants and animals that still abound today. We also pray in thanksgiving for the Endangered Species Act, which was enacted too late to save these 23 species in particular, but which has made great progress in conservation, and for the COP15 gathering on biodiversity that happened earlier this month. So close in the name of the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, sorry for the technical difficulties, but thank you again for being here. I am just going to do a brief land acknowledgement, and I think that this ties into biodiversity loss in a very important way, because due to the ongoing violence and trauma that is a part of the structure of colonialism, we see the results of the loss of biodiversity in our communities and in our worlds, and the erasure of the Native people who have stewarded the lands where we currently all live. And so I am based in what is now known as Cleveland, Ohio, And so I will share this land acknowledgement for the land where I live, and then I will put some links in the chat so that you can further explore the idea of territory acknowledgements in the land where you live. So in recognizing the land upon which I reside, I express deep gratitude to the Native people who have lived and worked here before me, those whose stewardship and resilient spirits have sustained the sacred land, which is the traditional home of the Erie, Lenape, Delaware, Shawnee, Wyandot, Miami, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and other Great Lakes tribes. And then finally, just a practice that I've recently learned about is an acknowledgement of context. So this idea that the context in which we gather is important, and we're meeting at a time when the human species is having an unprecedented impact on the planet. And so we just do this at the beginning of our gathering as a reminder that the discussions that we have here and the decisions that we make and the actions that we take will have consequences for other people and species, for future generations. And so this time is important. So thank you for being here. So without further ado, I'm going to do some Laudato Si updates later, but I just want to turn it over to Mark Mackey, Brother Mark Mackey, who is going to is our main reason for being here today, and who is going to present on a biodiversity project that he worked on with students in the past year. So Brother Mark, I turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Brenna. Thanks for kicking things off for us prayerfully, but bringing prayer into our planet and the other creatures that share this planet. So thanks for that. You know, I was thinking during Brenna's prayer, I did, you know, a little paper a couple years back on the philosophical theologian Thomas Aquinas that kind of influences a lot of church thinking. And one of the things he wrote centuries ago was in his kind of worldview, angels occupied the highest space, the most important kind of part of creation. But he said, you know, in a hypothetical universe that had angels compared to another universe that had angels and rocks, what he kind of considered like the lowest, least important in the great chain of being, the one with angels and rocks would be the better. It would be simply because it's just one more created thing, one more thing that came from the mind of the creator. So I don't know, that resonates with me. I know sometimes when I'm in my room and I find a tiny little soil mite in a potted plant, I just feel like my day's a little bit better, my room's a little bit better. And that same notion kind of applies to this idea of both the positive aspect and the negative of each lost species, what that does, why biodiversity is important. I talk about this sometimes in the terms of just my hat as an ecologist, and there's importance of biodiversity there. But now that we can speak in a space that involves faith and spirituality and a creator, we can bring in an even deeper importance of each additional thing. So keeping that in mind as we move forward. Can everybody hear me okay as we start out? Excellent. I see only a couple faces at a time, but they look riveted. So I must be doing a good start. So thanks for that. Let's see. So I'm going to be mostly talking about a little storyline that occurred last year when I had the chance to live and work at one of our Jesuit high schools in Indianapolis called Brebeuf. Hopefully you'll have a chance to look at some of the reflection materials I prepared, and Brenna prepared other materials for this month that'll include more of a link into our prayer lives and spiritual lives, because I think that's really important. A lot of what I'll focus on here is more just, is less of that and more kind of practical restoration side, but we can always bring in spiritual questions and spiritual aspects in the Q&A. So let's move forward. I want to introduce you to Brebeuf if you're not familiar with it, but in the course of the storyline of where it took place, in case I don't explicitly mention these points, just know that each one of these topics is part of the roadmap. Kind of, I'm going to talk about Brebeuf, this little paradise, this beautiful little spot that I grew to love that has its own ecosystem and set of biodiversity. And then, like any good storyline, there's trouble in paradise. Something happens that needs to be addressed. And after that, you know, after that unavoidable kind of trouble in paradise, there's some trouble that could have been avoided. It comes down to communication, the human aspect of things. We're going to talk about how in this community we decided to make a plan to move forward to address this. And one of the take-home messages of today is going to be, how do we bring in community, our communities, and engage other people in a situation like this? And then, just a non-spoiler alert, there's not really going to be a strong resolution to this because it's an ongoing story. And a lot of us want to have immediate results. I love that, that 2-hour shipping option. Actually, I don't love that, but I understand how convenient that is. And we're used to really quick conveniences, but a lot of this work when we're working with nature doesn't happen that quickly. So this is an ongoing story too. If you haven't had the pleasure, this is just an aerial photo of the campus of Brebeuf Jesuit. And it's funny, I'll tell friends when they're asking about where Brebeuf is, I'm like, honestly, it's in the middle of strip mall America. There's like every chain you can think of in about a half mile from Brebeuf's campus, right on 86th Street there on the north side. But what's nice too is that there's a bit of woods. Even though we have what used to be a Sam's Club right next door, there are these patches of woods. And this kind of patch of wood that surrounds the property here became kind of a saving grace for me, just a daily little respite, a little walk in nature. Officially, it was the cross-country trail for this school, but unofficially, it was Brother Mark's walking nature trail. So while I was on that trail, I would see a lot of different life, a lot of biodiversity. This was a young great horned owl. I would hear barred owls and great horned owls at night. They were fairly common, actually. I was surprised. There were fungi in the woods. There were a lot of different types of mushrooms and other fungi. This one in particular, maybe you recognize it, maybe you've eaten it. This one made it to my skillet and into a breakfast omelet later that day. It's called chicken of the woods. I know Michael Peterson in this call is a big fan of this type of mushroom. There were both, there's two creeks that come together in a confluence on Brebeuf's campus. We have Crooked Creek meets Delaware Creek. And I mean, honestly, they're flowing out of these retention ponds that are right near shopping malls that have plastic bags in them a lot of times, but there's also life in there. I would find adult snapping turtles, as well as once I was lucky to find one of these little babies and was able to go down like a great blue heron. I nabbed it, but unlike a great blue heron, it was catch and release in this case. And finally, if there are any Americans in this call, you may recognize the great bald eagle. Didn't live on our campus, but it had taken a little respite up in the tree limbs of one of our mighty sycamore trees on campus. So cool wildlife that I would send home photos to my friends and family. And it was just a place I really grew to love in the woods of Brebeuf. Now, I didn't mention this, but I've spent 2 stints at Brebeuf. The first one was just way back when as a novice. And by way back when, I mean, this was spring of 2017. And so not that long ago. And I got to spend a semester teaching environmental science and living at Brebeuf as part of my Jesuit formation. So this is where I first was able to, this was where I first was able to kind of get to know Brebeuf and the not only the people, but the animals and plants here too. But after I returned, we ended up having a bit of an issue on campus. And it wasn't unique to Brebeuf's campus. We had an invasive species called the emerald ash borer. Can I get you to raise your hand if you've ever heard of the emerald ash borer? Anybody out there? A lot of Midwesterners may recognize it. It's one of the reasons we're not supposed to move around firewood, is because part of this Asian beetle's life cycle is that it'll burrow into wood, and it likes the white ash tree, but while doing so, it'll actually kill the tree, and it's really pretty devastating. Like I said, we're not unique. You can see not only the rest of Indiana, but a lot of other states that have the green part of this are ash trees, and the red sites were initial kind of findings of the emerald ash borer. So just right around the time, this map's from 2018, but around the time I left Brebeuf, the emerald ash borer was coming through and had pretty immediate effects. And so one of the main trees in our canopy on campus died. They died and pretty quickly went about the way of dead trees. Unfortunately, on a campus, when you have dead trees, you kind of have to address, they become a safety hazard as well. So here's what happened. I didn't have many photos of the ash trees, but this is from one of the teachers from his drone. And you can see although a lot of these trees are dormant during wintertime, the dead trees accumulated quickly, and Brebeuf as a school had to find a way to address this. And they had to hire a tree consulting company, which many of you may know. I know my dad knows that can be quite expensive. But the first round was just felling the trees, getting them down, the ones that were a safety hazard. After that, though, we had the issue of having a lot of dead trees around on the ground. And to be quite honest, the initial consultation, the group didn't do the best job. It was a bit of a botched job, and there were trees that were over the creek that had to later be removed. So that was step one of some of the issues that came about from this invasive species. I have to remind myself sometimes this wasn't just management issues. It initially started from a natural phenomenon of an invasive species moving through, which we know from predictions of climate change, this will just be an increasing phenomenon. But the trees had to be left. But right as we were getting into a plan of maybe how to go about cleaning up the woods, how to go about a restoration project, COVID happened. And so a lot of the efforts just kind of stopped, like so many other things. So that was a big factor too, another kind of natural factor that was out of the hands of any individual group. And, in the subsequent time, Brebeuf's grounds crew, great crew, they tried to take some of the approaches into their own hands. They thought, we have some machinery, maybe we can go about clearing out some of this wood and clearing some of the invasive species in the process. Unfortunately, the crew wasn't really educated in this. They kind of just enjoyed using heavy machinery, I think, and they kind of overstepped the boundaries of what sort of work we would want to do in the woods. And that started becoming clear. This was happening around the time I was back on campus, and myself and a couple other teachers who keep an eye on the woods said, hey, you know what's going on with this project? And there weren't any clear answers. And so one of the first steps that got all of the subsequent project into motion was myself and a couple people just saying, looking in and say, do we have a clear plan moving forward? Do we know what we're doing, or are we just using machinery and moving around some dead trees? And so for me, it took finding out what's the chain of command here in this context. Who has the call? Who is it that is calling the shots as far as how we're going to move forward? And when I looked into that, it became clear there was some major communication breakdowns and there wasn't a clear plan. So I was able to get just a pause on everything to say, how about we stop any more clearing or moving, and let's just see what our plan moving forward is, and how maybe we can get a little bit better communication, because I was taught from a young age, communicate, because if you have a breakdown of communication, it's never a good thing for all parties involved. So around this time, I also was just looking at what Brenna is going to tell us a bit more about this global top-down movement in the church that came from Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. And the question is, how do we keep moving forward with some action? How do we put this on the ground? And 7 Laudato Si action goals came out of this. And I had just read through, and I knew a couple of these I was pretty good on. I teach ecological education, great. I really enjoyed dipping into ecological spirituality, but it was the last one, number 7, or the one that says community engagement and participation. And I realized, if I'm being honest, at times I can find myself wanting to be a bit of a lone wolf, wanting to just figure out how can I work on this project. It's easier if it's just me working on this. And what I've learned, especially in my time as a Jesuit, especially in my time living in community, it's how can we loop in other people for the betterment of all? And so this emphasis on bringing people in at a local level, I recognize not only do many hands make light work, but also people engaging in a project have more ownership over this. And so I was thinking at the same time, we don't want to just pay a company to come in and do a restoration project for us. How can we make sure we engage our community at the same time? Not to mention the youth. Accompanying youth to a hope-filled future is one of our goals. And I'm at a high school. So how can we bring in those dedicated students? So these wheels are slowly turning in my mind. A little smoke was coming from it, but I realized, no, these are good ideas. How can I move forward in this context? And I knew the first audience I wanted to go to. Brebeuf is blessed to have a great, active, young people making up the Brebeuf Conservation Club. A couple photos of these students. They had a big push just before COVID called What's Up? Single-use plastics. And they basically got rid of all the single-use plastics at Brebeuf and had this great little leadership team. But unfortunately, like so many things, COVID kind of took the wind out of the sails. Unfortunately, there was more single-use plastic than ever because of COVID protocols. And the group was kind of down a little bit. And so I said, what better group to kind of engage and have us engage this topic that we're thinking about, restoring our woodlands. So these next couple slides are just slides I took and gave a pitch to the Conservation Club. I went to one of their meetings after school, and I basically just said, hey guys, here's our situation, how can you help? I gave them the bit of the background I just gave you about how the woods were cleared out because it wasn't really clear to everybody what was going on. So that was step one. Step two was just saying, how can we include the community, that seventh Laudato Si goal? How can we make this more than just a contracted project that we pay money for? How can we get more ownership from both students and faculty and staff and make this a learning project along the way? This is part of education, right? And then finally, so many people were used to being cooped up for the past year at COVID. It was time to get some hands-on work, get some hands in the soil and doing it together. And I thought, this is the time. Let's turn this into a project we can collaborate on. I can't see this, but I think, do you see the little thing that says I had an inspired thought on the bottom? Good, good. My memory is still there. And here's where a little bit of personal experience came in. I have a brother-in-law. His name is Kerry, and Kerry does a lot of, he got really interested in biodiversity in the plant level, native plants, how to restore our lawns from the turf grass that so many people have to bringing in a bit more diversity. You may know, maybe we can look into this later, but native plants are able to bolster the native biodiversity of insects, of birds, of rodents, all the things that have evolved in this ecosystem with them, right? And so the more we can bring in native plants and to increase the number of plants that are there or the biodiversity, the better. So Kerry had been doing this at the level of a dad on his own property, which is great, right? The real grassroots level. And about a year before this, Kerry had called on me and my siblings, my mom and dad, to help with this little project he had. And we said, okay, we'll throw you a bone here, Kerry. What is it? So we go over and he had this whole setup. And basically what Kerry did is he was using a method that's called winter sowing, where you basically make these little greenhouses. And the best way to make them is out of milk jugs. And what happens is you put in potting soil, you put in the seeds of the native plants, and this is during the winter months. It can be as early as December or January, as late as February, March, depending on where you are. You plant the seeds into the soil, close it up. It creates the greenhouse effect within that jug. Water and snow will help to create moisture, and it creates a little environment in which these plants, which have to go through cold germination, can have a safe, low competition spot to germinate. I'll give you more details of what that looks like later, but Kerry introduced me to this, and that went towards a little native prairie patch back on our home spot that he's been growing. And so I thought, that's a good idea. That's one of the ways that we can engage students at Brebeuf. And so I said, how about we try this miniature greenhouse approach? What do you think, students of Brebeuf? And then I said, here's how I could imagine, or we brainstormed, here's what this could look like. We're going to need help from students to, first of all, just collect all those milk jugs, right? Maybe we put a drive, people bring them in. Many families go through a lot of cereal and milk. And sure enough, we were able to bring in a lot of empty milk jugs. That was step one. Step two was we needed help making these greenhouses. So I said, what do you think? Would you be able to help us out? We'll need some potting soil, some other things. Like I said, many hands make light work. And then I said, we have a time frame here. This was happening in late February, early March, and I can't do all this myself. And so I really needed the help of the students. And I said, what do you say? Does this seem feasible? So I kind of rolled it out to them, and beautifully, and much to my joy, the Conservation Club sprang right into action. Within a day, we had things like these little posters that were made. They named it Brebeuf Blooms. We picked a day, we picked rooms, we worked around Brebeuf's schedule and said, this is going to be our day for making our greenhouses. So we started putting the call out already. We also started bringing in milk jugs, and every day you'd start to see students getting dropped off, carrying in their empty milk jugs and salad containers. We put out a little blurb in the newsletter, just kind of telling them what kind of things we could use, as well as how the education about how this is going to be not only part of growing more, but replacing non-native species like honeysuckle that were on the campus. And, you know, I didn't want to, early on, I wasn't sure. I didn't know if this would be a burden to students or how well they would take it. But right after I pitched the idea to the Conservation Club, one of the students, Eli, and by the way, Brebeuf has some amazing students, like a lot of our schools, and Eli is one of them. And he came up to me and he said, Brother Mark, I've got my own landscaping company with my brother and just a little side hustle that this high schooler has. And he said, I can get us the topsoil for cheaper, and I'd like to do that. So I said, great, community movement coming together. And he came to school with his own dump truck and was able to get us started because we needed bulk potting soil to fill our milk jugs. So we started getting word out. Emily During, who's the president of the club, she made these neat little name tags. We ended up having, we picked 6 native species. This one was purple coneflower, and each person, when they picked which plant they wanted to make in their greenhouse, they'd get one of these little name tags. This one says, my name's purple coneflower from the genus Echinacea, comes from the Greek word echino, meaning hedgehog, referring to my spiny browns on the central cone. So she had these 6 little creative ideas. Here are the other native plants that we had. And so already things that were more creative than I would be able to come up with and cuter and more aesthetic than I could do. These students became animators right away. And here, without even being asked to do this, here's a little 50-second video clip that the students came up with. There we go. So students put out the word and the other students responded. So here are just some snapshots of the days where we had some room set aside. We were on hybrid schedule. This was the crazy year of teaching in a high school, by the way. And so we had to do this 2 days in a row, but we had students come out. We had stations for making the different greenhouses. Students could pick which plants they wanted to do. One of the environmental science teachers made some cheesy memes out of some of the photos. So here we go, students at work. Here's some other, just putting together, labeling, digging soil, doing this in March when you just can't really be outside and it's not pleasant. But so keep this in mind for your own schools or institutions or homes, that this can be a good way to start feeling like you're getting in the garden before it's even pleasant weather to be out in the garden. Once the students finished these up, they had the choice of either keeping them at the school or taking them, which was out near our raised beds, because these little greenhouses actually have to be outside. You don't want to put them in your garage or in your room. They need to be outside because native plants go through a winter, right? And they need that winter to start their germination process. All in all, we had over 300, I think it was 333 milk jugs from the students, which was great that we were able to get that many empty milk jugs, let alone to have students come up and plant them for us. And here was another neat thing that came about from this movement. There was kind of this energy that was building around this and some excitement, and the faculty and staff wanted in on this too. And we had an annual faculty staff retreat that happens every year. And so we said, well, how about we just continue this theme? So we made it on basically Laudato and environmental reconciliation, which is what our school was going through. And it was neat because not only did the teachers all at the end of the day get to make their own greenhouses as well to add to the mix, but we actually identified about 12 faculty and staff at Brebeuf, each one with kind of a different environmental interest. And then they led these breakout sessions that day for us that other teachers could sign up for. We had 2 keynote speakers that were faculty members that just got to further this passion of environmental justice and reconciliation and stewardship. So an amazing kind of addition that came from the students' excitement and movement. Let's see if this video works. Just a little 6 weeks later, if you're curious what the milk jugs look like. you start to peek in and see some of the little seedlings coming up.
These are coming up.
You hear a red-winged blackbird in the background. This is springtime.
Mom, are you in there? Hey. All right, let's just kind of success. Nice work.
Cool. So it works. They come up, they germinate. And then along with this, there were just other kind of collaborations bringing people into this. The Social Justice Club usually uses the raised beds to grow vegetables to give the food pantries, but we talked to them and they'd say, yeah, we'd like to be a part of this project. You can use the raised beds. We'll help you weed them and clear them out. Because what we found is that we weren't able to transplant as so quickly as we'd like. So having these nursery beds was a good way to raise up these plants to get them to the size where they would actually transplant better into the woods. We also had our environmental science classes, AP classes jumped in the mix. They helped us to identify which of the seedlings were the native plant that we wanted and which one were weeds that had gotten in, because weeds are pervasive. But it also gave them a little hands-on identification and transplanting work. So simultaneous to this happening and to this planting, there was another piece of the story happening with another invasive species. If you walk along the property of Brebeuf, you'll see one of the dominant plants there, the understory plant. About 90% of the understory was honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle or Amur honeysuckle. Not native to the US. And you can see there's a lot of other places in the Midwest, including Cincinnati, where I'm from, where honeysuckle is a big invasive species. It tends to just take over. And when it takes over, it displaces the native plants and native biodiversity. Here's just a little shot of the cross-country trail, and you can see all along the sides, thick honeysuckle. Simultaneous to our efforts with the students and to getting Brebeuf blooms, hands on the ground, we knew that we wanted to supplement this work from professionals as well. So we also had some local environmental consultants come out, check out the land, make sure we were having a guided approach moving forward for restoring our woods. And we even got this very detailed map let out for where exactly we could plant very specific species if we wanted to bolster the understory. So we had this information, but we also knew and were told that without addressing the honeysuckle, we can't get very far. That had to be the first step. And so I know I went through a discernment with a couple of the teachers of this question. We said, you know, it would be great to engage the community, right? That Laudato Si goal. But at the same time, it would take probably countless weekends for our 15 acres of coordinating high schoolers and teachers to try to get these volunteer crews to go out and cut honeysuckle, which is a great activity, but it would not have actually addressed our honeysuckle issue. And so we started to look into what if we've got a contractor to come in and do it in one fell swoop, which is expensive, but going to be worth it as far as the actual ecological payoff. And so we found some ecological consultants or some forestry consultants to the DNR. They were called Arbor Terra. They came out, we walked the property with them. And long story short, they gave us a proposal and we were able to accept it, make a contract to have all of our 15 acres removed mechanically. And then later with herbicide, which is basically how you have to treat honeysuckle, to have the professional group do all of it. And so instead of being a couple-year process that at best we would make a dent in, we were able to invest in this, which surprisingly to me, with the right machinery, all happened within 1 week of our spring break when we were all off campus. So that was a pretty amazing thing that I didn't realize was possible, especially with this. I forget what they call this machine, but it spins in the front and they can go in and get back. So most of it, they didn't even have to do by hand. They could do by machine. And the machine is light enough that it doesn't compact the soil that much, which I was worried about because soil compaction can really degrade an ecosystem, and they were able to work around that. So that was step one of what's going to be a couple-year process of treating the honeysuckle. Mechanically, in that 1 week, it was like night and day. The machines went through and they were able to pretty non-invasively remove our honeysuckle shrub. And to be quite honest, this happened in middle March over spring break. And already as that season progressed and we had our usual spring ephemerals, we saw a lot more spring plants than we normally would because honeysuckle had taken about 90% of the sunlight that was otherwise reaching the forest floor. So a lot of the seed bank was able to naturally regenerate. And that was something we realized. It's not feasible to go out and replant all of the woods. That's not what we want either. We want to work with Mother Earth, work with the planet, and use that natural seed bank and regeneration, which happened once the honeysuckle was removed. Here are some of just the species I saw last time I walked through there that I saw sprouting up. And so as I come towards a conclusion, I just want to say, this caring for our common home, it's been named in the Society of Jesus as one of the top 4 priorities that we want to focus on in the next 10 years as we move forward. We do a lot of things across our broad society, our religious order, and caring for the common home is one of them. But as somebody pointed out, it's really helpful to look at the verbs in these apostolic preferences. In this case, we're called to collaborate and care for our common home, getting away from that lone wolf mentality, getting away from that, well, just what can I do and how can I make this happen? To say, what people do I know? What resources do we share? How can I loop in other people to make this a learning, hands-on, and spiritually engaging activity? So with that, I thank you and happy to take any questions. And if you have questions about this photo, this was a card that was sent to me by the science department when I left from one of my favorite movies, Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls. So thank you for your time and attention.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions now, you can feel free to, I think we're a small enough group that you can unmute yourself. If you want to raise your hand, you can, but otherwise, feel free to ask away. Oh, so I see.
Fran, is your hand up? Yeah, Fran.
So here's a question that's been bothering me for a while. I agree that all God's creatures reflect God's glory, the Creator's glory, but you mentioned the emerald ash borer and other invasive species. And I've also been thinking of COVID and infectious disease organisms, how do we think about those?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I'm not sure there's an answer, but.
Yeah, I've struggled with that for a while. That same brother-in-law who taught me how to winter sow, he has a deep-seated conflict with starlings, European starlings. They one time displaced some native woodpeckers that were right out his back window, and he was really happy to watch the chicks grow up, and the starlings kicked out that native woodpecker, and he may have been known to bring out a pellet gun every once in a while. But I guess it comes down to an intrinsic value of something. I mean, it's there. It's not like the European starling is a mistake, right? But I guess when we simultaneously view from the lens of our ecosystems, we also know that the European starling's native to Europe. And so when it's disruptive and degrades a biodiversity, I guess from a management standpoint, we can say it would be right to go about bringing back natural levels. Now, you're right, Fran, and that there's not a really clear answer because people can disagree on what kind of species we want to see around. But I guess as an ecologist, I'd say there's certain metrics we can say. We can say, well, if it's outside of the range in which it evolved, which is partly why native plants can support so much native biodiversity, is because they co-evolve with the insects that pollinate them and disperse their seeds. So that can be an informed way of managing. I think that even if you go about removing honeysuckle or starlings, you shouldn't do it with hatred in your heart. You shouldn't see them as enemies. I think you can remove these things and be sorry if you have to remove or kill an invasive species. So to me, that's the difference. And we can do it in a loving way without somehow projecting onto these things like they're evil and they're trying to take over, because those starlings aren't evil. They're just really good at living and passing on their genes, which means they're really good at the game of life, I guess.
That may be a very human question that I asked too, from a human point of view. But if you look at everything else,
Yeah,
they're just trying to make their own living too,
And I was teaching recently in my classes here at Loyola basic population biology, and we show the curve of how all populations grow. And the thing that makes a population start to stabilize is environmental resistance, which amount of food, but also space and things like disease. And so disease is a natural way that keeps populations in check. And yes, it's very complicated. I would not want to say that disease is good and that it's a good thing that we're losing human lives. No, but I would also say that disease is part of being alive on this planet Earth, the same Earth that Jesus stepped into the ecosystems and planetary systems here too. So, but yeah, it's an interesting and complicated one.
Am I unmuted? Okay.
Yes.
Brother Mark, on the Brebeuf, what kind of acreage are you talking about at the school in the back there that you developed or redeveloped?
Yeah. Thanks. It's strange having your own father call you brother, but I appreciate that. The acreage, although the total acreage is about 15 acres, the original place that we started on that kind of got over cleared by machinery was only a couple acres, but it was right next to a stream. It was in a riparian area. So we knew we wanted to take extra care of it. And then that kind of extended into another, there are probably 7 continuous acres in that part of the property. But when you went to the other corner, there were another maybe 5 continuous acres. So there was patchy, but the other thing about that is the context in which we were working. It's pretty complicated if you've ever worked with invasive species. We wanted to make sure we had an obligation to clear out as much honeysuckle as we could because that's going to reseed more area, but we can't control the properties around us. And you can imagine that all the properties around us have a lot of honeysuckle as well. So, and the birds eat the berries and you know how they pass that along. So it was, what we realized we wanted to do is we wanted to make that investment in clearing out all the acres at once, but it's going to be a lot of work moving forward for our conservation club to just upkeep and to make sure the honeysuckle stays back. And you can do that with seedlings and stump sprouts a lot easier than a honeysuckle bush that has a diameter because it's been growing for 20 years. So yeah, it's interesting to think about the specific context of Brebeuf.
I guess I didn't realize it was that big. And I guess it's kind of a little showpiece now, and that can be enlarged, and you can get that club to almost bring, you know, shall we say, maybe some of the inner schools and so on out to kind of study it and to be taught the different methods on that piece of property. Is that a possibility? I mean,
it is. And you know, it's interesting. One of the students I actually taught in her freshman bio, who was part of this, her dad is a professor at a local university, IUPUI. And so we've actually started a collaboration with that university and another Catholic university called Marian. And we're actually connected by the same Crooked Creek I mentioned. If you followed that, if Michael Peterson got in his inflatable kayak and went for 20 miles to the south, he would actually end up just before the White River confluence. He would be connected to Marian University, which does not feel like, it feels so far away, but we realize we're literally connected by this water source. And so we're starting to see how we can have our high school students go to Marian. They have this thing called an eco lab that they're developing, and they're going to have Marian students and faculty come to Brebeuf. So it is kind of neat that this original project, kind of its own little case study of taking care of our own land, just in a year has already started to build connections and to spread out. And I told the students from day one in that conservation club meeting, we're part of a Jesuit network. We're part of the Ignatian Secondary School Network, just like the colleges are part of a network. And what one school does, we can learn from, like you said, and we can replicate this and we can communicate and say, here's what worked. Don't get this kind of soil. Start earlier, and we can even improve as we move forward too.
Well, son, good job. You got something to come back to every year.
That's right.
Even just hearing you talk about that process sounds like the process of biodiversity itself in nature, right? Like Brebeuf doing this project has created all of these other connections, and it's allowing collaboration and mutual thriving. So that's really wonderful. Thanks so much, Brother Mark. We're going. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you again for being with us today. just very quickly before we close, I just wanted to share a couple of resources that we have. So I put the agenda in the chat, but tomorrow, oh, sorry for that. Tomorrow I will send out an email with the recording. Mark, if you're willing to share your slides, I'll put those in the email as well. And then the agenda for today has, you could really run a similar program at your own institution, sharing the video and then having the conversation. And at the bottom, I just have some additional resources. So if you're excited about implementing the Laudato Si action platform, there's a letter from Cardinal Turkson that you could use to kind of get some buy-in at your institution. There are 40 days of prayer resources that can be used right now between now and November 14th to get people excited about the platform. And then at the bottom, I have some biodiversity resources. So COP15 just wrapped up about a week ago. And so I didn't realize this, and I'm sorry, my Slack is going. So that's that noise. The US is one of the only countries that's not signed on to this biodiversity treaty. So I think that that's an important thing to let our representatives know that we care about. And then I just have another little kind of blurb at the bottom about doing a bio blitz at your institution. So getting people out to figure out what are the native plants and species that exist where you are and documenting them, because that's really important for the continuation of biodiversity and promoting that in our own communities. So again, thanks for sticking with us. It's 4:30. Round of applause to Mark. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom and for this great project. Please reach out to me if you have any questions, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks for being here. Feel free to reach out if you have any follow-up questions.
Yeah.